Hello, my name is Agustín Pérez Rubio, and I'm one of the co-curators of the 11th Berlin Biennale. We are now in one of the 4 venues of this edition. Here we are at Gropius Bau. This part of the parcours in this museum is more to understand how we can build another kind of narrative, how we can fulfill with these invisible bodies, invisible histories, invisible also narrations and knowledge that modernity was putting apart. So all of the journey, all of the parcours in this section, it's more about how we are objectivizing the cultures that these objects are coming from. The artist wants to come up with several strategies. Some of them are coming in the idea of healing, restitution, but also the curators, we wanted to address how other kind of museums, how can alternative museums could address several ideas in order to foster healthy practices in our institutions and museums. Coming by this idea of the inverted museum, we decided to use the space in an opposite manner that usually the Gropius Bau do. We want that the museum, in this counter-narrative, the public will come just from the back and to enter by this corridor. The first artist that we will see is the Peruvian artist Sandra Camara. She did a really deep research into the objects from pre-Columbian cultures that nowadays are in mainly Spanish and European museums. She did these amazing paintings in this idea of the trompeler using the Baroque point of view, because the Baroque, it was the first style imposed by the colony into the Latin American lands, and from there we can see these different objects as an ethnographical museum. When you are in the back, every single object has a name, a derogatory denomination that usually in the history, even in the contemporaneity, the Westerns, we put inside this culture. We denominate these cultures. Sandra Camara, at the same time with the paintings that she presents, she questions us how we are objectivizing these cultures into a museum inside these glass vitrines, glass showcases, as we do also in the contemporary area with the human beings.
I am standing here in front of Aline Baiana's installation. After Sandra Camara, the visitors can see this installation from a very particular perspective. And from there, you can actually see that this cross of the south is actually a constellation that you can see only from the southern hemisphere. This constellation was actually guiding the first European colonizers in the 16th century in order to arrive to South America. But in this work, as you can see closer, the stars are turned into rocks that are representing different minerals that have been extracted from Brazil since the beginning of colonization. So in this work, Aline Baiana is also addressing the collective trauma and the environmental issues that extractivism has brought to Brazil since the beginning of colonization. When she did this research trip to Brazil in order to look herself for these stones, she specifically chose the rocks also according to their sizes and volume, because what you can see here in the way they are disposed and hanged is also corresponding to the thousands of minerals that are being extracted in Brazil. Each of these stones represent our iron, manganese, copper, and the sizes are a representation of the amount of how much of these minerals is being extracted, even until today.
Coming from the installation of Aline Baiana, we enter in this immersive installation created by the group of theater artists from Colombia, Mapa Teatro. They made this installation based on 3 different videos and also a stage where they tell a kind of ethnofiction based of a real story from 1969 that happens to 3 white men in the Amazon. In the original story, an expedition of 3 men, a trader, a fur trafficker, and a gold prospector, happened upon a maloca, a ceremonial space of an indigenous community in voluntary isolation. After the encounter, 2 of the men disappeared forever. Only the gold digger, who was also a huaquero, a grave robber, returned to Bogota, where he became a goldsmith, exorcising the ghosts that returned in his dreams by making forgeries of pre-Columbian statues.
Coming from the installation by Mapa Teatro, we can see the work of Andrés Pereira Paz, an artist from Bolivia, who created this installation in 2020, and it's called I Fortify Your Columns. The first thing that you may notice here is the sound of a bird and its heartbeat. This bird is called guajojo, and it's typical from the Amazons. When the burnings took place last year in the Amazon, the bird had to fly away and look for a new habitat to live in. The bird was finally found in the Andes, and that's why also this heartbeat is listened in this installation. The visitor can actually go through these sculptures that are references to the drawings of Felipe Guamán Pomada Ayala, who was the first Amerindian chronicle for the Spanish crown in the 16th century. These shapes are moons, suns, and stars that are falling from the sky into the earth, also alluding to a different time and space where we can also understand and get in touch with the history and the past of these colonies. In this installation, Dina Bowen goes into the social networks that shaped Canadian culture in the early 20th century. In this film, she also portrays how Canadian identity was shaped by white settler and nationalist ideals. The theater play The God of Gods was actually performed for the first time in 1922 in the first Canadian National Theatre, Hart House.
But what exactly would whiteface, what would that look like? And what would its political impact be? I don't know that we have to have an answer to that, but I think it's something to consider as a counter gesture.
Now we enter in this bright room with the work of the Turkish artist Aykan Safoglu. For us, it's very important this room because if we were following the notion of the colonialistic ways of producing knowledge in museums, now for us we arrive to another understanding how the coloniality also it implies in the notion of education, pedagogy, and in the institutions as a school, universities, and other ways of knowledge are produced in this coloniality. In that way, Safoglu presents two body of works, from the personal to the political, from the social to the biographical. In this long threesome made by a stripe of photographic works, he intertwined images of his early years in the German-Turkish school in Istanbul. This school, it was well known as the highest boys, Elker Lise, a school for a very good tradition on westernization concepts like emancipation of liberation, but really what we are facing also in the narration, amazing narration that he's doing with his video from a personal journey that he did with his parents, is how colonial it was, this education in this specific and personal experience, but also we can think about how many of our knowledges are coming from this tradition too.
Die Demütigungen waren so vernichtend, dass mein langsam in die Pubertät schlüpfender Kindeskörper darauf reagieren musste. Meine Nase blutete morgens immer sehr stark. Einmal hat es so extrem geblutet, dass ich morgens ohnmächtig wurde und statt zur Schule wurde ich ins Krankenhaus gebracht.
So we are now in the room of Antonio Piccia. He's an artist from San Pedro La Laguna in Guatemala. The selection of works that you can see here are 4 sculptures and 1 video. In the video, you can actually see the artist himself doing a Mayan ritual that is to heal the soul of a person. In his sculptures, he's playing with the typical furniture that they use to do the Jaspe textiles in his hometown. This loom is generally used in an horizontal way, and here you can see it placed in a vertical position with the different threads that are used to do this textile.
In this idea of museums and looking for alternative, showing the different knowledges that we can learn from other cultures, other people, for us it was very important to present the work, or mainly 2 important institutions. The first one is Museum Osorio Cesar. For us, these represent how these hegemonic powers were always pushing what we call normativity in the way that we perceive the aesthetics or even art. The second museum that we present in relation with the Osorio Cesar, it's the Museum of the Imagens Inconscientes, that it was found in the 50s, but a very strong and intelligent woman, Nisida Silveira. She was working a lot against the therapy, against the psychiatry, so we can define herself as an anti-psychiatric institution, but on the other hand, instead of therapy, she wanted to create with her patients more emotional moments and tenderness moments.
It was in September 1946 that Adelina began to work at the painting atelier in the occupational therapy section, which had recently opened. In spite of her consistent negativism at the hospital where she lived, it was not difficult to get her to paint in the atelier. In fact, she seemed to enjoy working with pencils and paintbrushes. Her earliest works depicted cats. Tabby Cat in Bed was the title she gave to her first drawing, which shows a cat lying on a narrow bed, her large tits quite prominent.
We are now in the installation of the filmmaker, artist, thinker, and activist Mapuche, Francisco Huichaqueo. He made not only his show, his films, that during the last years he was working, even with a new production, that we can see also the ways that the rituals and the small details that he put in relation with his culture, the Mapuche culture, not only on the language, also on the different forms of rituals that they have to preserving and determining his own territory. In one of the walls of the room, we can read it, spiritualistic before reason. And that is a very important key to understand and to give voice to these people that during many years were completely invisibilized. Huichaqueo made a very subtle act and ritual of healing. Together with these projections, he went to the Dahlem Museum to make a research into the collection of Mapuches artifacts that the museum from Berlin owns. In this ritual, he wanted that the museum and the conservators brought the objects that they have in the collection here. And later, he implemented this white rock that is a kind of healing.
After Francisco Huichaqueo's room, we enter here where we can see the work of Kate Kollwitz, the tragic series by Flavio Di Carvalho, and the installation Not a Pillar, Not a Pie by Katerina Scheller. The work of Kate Kollwitz was very important since the beginning for the curatorial research, as she was portrayed for the first time in the Club de Artistas Modernos in CAM in 1933. After she was expelled by the Académie der Kunst that year for fighting against the Nazi regime, in Brazil, they organized these exhibitions with at least 80 of her prints. The way we arrived to the work of Kate Kollwitz was very early in our research. The selection of works that we have chosen for the Berlin Biennale are related, first of all, with the group of mothers. It's the first work that you can see. Afterwards, you can continue seeing a selection of works that is mainly focusing on the masses and how people come together in order to resist and to struggle against oppression and social injustice. In this room, we can see her work in dialogue with Katerina Scheller, who is a contemporary artist that has been researching the gestures in Kate Kollwitz's prints. This work has different videos and also a new piece produced specifically for the Berlin Biennale, which is the research that she did also about Dore Hoyer. Dore Hoyer produced in 1946 a choreography called Tanz for Kate Kollwitz. They both approach the artistic practice from a proto-feminist perspective, and in this sense, the pictures that you can see in the vitrines are all from the Tanz for Kate Kollwitz. This is the tragic series done in 1947 by Flavio Di Carvalho. Here we can see 9 different drawings of his mother dying. She died of a cancer, and what he is trying also to do in these drawings is to sort of grasp the last breath, the last moments with him.
Entering into this room is to understand more the notion of the time in this coloniality, and also understanding how we can escape these notions of the stolen time in different societies, not only in relation with the bodies of the objects, but also thinking about the idea of self-ethnography instead of ethnography. The first artist that we find is Shubinaya Shona, an Inuit artist for Cape d'Osseur community in the north of we would call Canada. And she is putting on question this, how her community is thinking about the time in another completely different Western understanding of our time in the linear way. Castiel Vitorino Brasileño, a trans Afro-Brazilian artist, went to the store of the antiquarian and she found this mask, because these objects are not a typical and original African mask. They are papel mache masks, mainly made for carnivals of other things. She's wondering how these objects are also creating an exotism and how we can erase this notion of exotism and otherness. The diversity of different masks, mainly from Global South, that we can see in the amazing work made by Pasita Vat in the 80s, called Marcos and His Crony, is a kind also of self-ethnography in the way that a Filipino woman artist, self-defined as Black woman. She tells the story of the terrible trauma that the Philippine population suffered during the Marcos and Imelda regime during a lot of time in their dictatorship. The main character is Marcos, devouring the population of Philippines, and also right and left is Imelda and the prime ministers, and all of them, they are like the court or the Senate that he has. In that sense, this political work is also referring to the own history of the Philippines at the same time that Pasita Abad is telling the story of the Global South also in her mask series that we can see in the atrium of the Gropius Bau in different trapunto paintings made by textile murals. Finally, before we leave the room, we find the video work by La Rara Truppe. They are a Spanish artist group who used to talk about the psychosocial sickness. In this work, they do a remake of the famous Danish avant-garde film from '67, The Perfect Human.
Det skal vi undersøge. Nu skal vi se, hvordan det perfekte menneske ser ud, og hvad det kan.
Here we enter in the zone de troc, or the barter zone, of the Senegalese artist Pelagie Gebagidi. Actually, he likes to define herself as a contemporary griot, as she brings histories from the past and put them together in the present. The drawings that we can see here were made this year during the lockdown, also bringing histories of the pandemic in her homeland and also during her lockdown in Brussels. The textiles that we can also see here were done in collaboration with women that were knitting over the textiles, and especially these animals that have an important presence also in the space are also speaking about this notion of healing from the institution. As we saw before with some other artists at the beginning with Sandra Gamarra, Pelagie in this case is also asking the souls of these dissected and cut animals where they want to be, where they want to belong. This also relates in a way with what we explained before about the work of Francisco Huichaqueo and this notion of restitution of these objects, and especially the soul of them.
Coming from the healing room of Pelagie, we just encountered these three big textiles made by the artist Sian Dairit, a Filipino artist who lives in Manila. And in these works, he made a really deep research about the different colonialization and imperialism regimes that Philippines suffered, from Spanish conquest to Japanese imperialism and also the US American moment. In these works, we can see how he printed photographs made by American soldiers at the beginning of 20th century. On top of this, these embroidered designs, this kind of imaginary that is related in between religions quilt and in relation of these quilting textiles that in Philippines it calls anti-anti. In the bigger artwork, Tropical Terror Tapestry, we see this big map of the Philippines, and we see these military bases that during a lot of years from the beginning of the 20th century occupy the territory. So in a way, this work, it's more like a synthesis talking about the military regimes and also the militarization of the territories from beginning of the century until right now, mainly in the south of the country now, where President Duterte is taking out the lands to the indigenous people in Mindanao. all of these small stories, all of these rebellions, and all of these fights against this militarization also is telling in different QR, where the mobile phones can carry us to the news and in different web pages when we see how strong it was, the history and the sad history of this imperialism, but on the other hand, how much the people from Philippines rebellion to that. Sharing the same space with Sianda Irit and talking about the territories, the militarization, the extractivism also for this indigenous part of Philippines and now in South America, we present the work that is behind me of the artist Bartolina Sciscia.
Sangra de pena y dolor, las injusticias de siglos siguen en pie y con ardor.
Bartolina Sciscia is a character created by Massimiliano Mamani that is a drag folk or chola. It's an indigenous drag that he created in this relation with the decolonial queerness. When Mamani performed Bartolina Sciscia, it's a kind of rebellion, it's a kind of empowerment, because he took the name from this revolutionary woman that he was murdered by the Spaniards at the end of 18th century in the rebellion. She was an Aymara woman, and in that way, when Mamani performed Bartolina, it's a kind of rebellion against the hegemonic powers, the patriarchal powers, talking about ethnicity, talking about gender, and talking about, the coloniality of the land and the ecosystem.
La tierra imperiada, implosionada, torturada, patriarcada, patrullada para pocos, mucha plata para todos los demás, nada de nada.
We are here now in the last room of the exhibition. After seeing the work of Sianda Irit and Pelagique Baguidi, we enter in the room where the Museum of Solidarity and Noura Boarafé's work are displayed.
صوت قطرات المي بتأكد إنه الطريق صح.
The film that is behind me was shot in 2018, and here the Palestinian artist reflects also in relation to the history of collections and the way we classified objects, animals, etc. In this opportunity, she's also dealing with animals, as we saw before with Pelagie, but in this case, she's analyzing how institution, in this case the zoo, can also be understood as a space of violence, of classification, and also of oppression.
Museum of the Solidarity Salvador Allende is a collection. There are more than 700 artworks that it was donated from the people to the people of Chile. That it happens in the early 70s due to the coup d'etat that made the dictatorship of Pinochet until the end of the 80s. The museum, it was a museum without walls during many years because artists, international artists all around the world, not only Chilean or Latin American, even from Japan, United States, even Africa, Palestinian, were donated at pieces to support the people and not, against this imperialistic and dictatorship regime. In that way, this notion of solidarity is something that they address doing this act of donation, creating a museum in solidarities with their partners, their colleagues, the people from the art, and also the people that was suffering this terrible political situation. The Museum of the Solidarity Salvador Allende has different chapters in itself, in the history of itself, because from the coup d'etat until the end of the dictatorship, this amount of 700 works, they couldn't not be exhibited in their own country. So that's why this museum, it was traveling, it was kind of collection in exile, that it was, different people, refugees abroad the country, and many people from art institutions against these dictatorial regimes was trying to do group shows, also getting money for the refugees and trying to be solidary for the people in Chile and also against this regime. During this period of what is called Museum of the Resistance, this collection in exile was in different parts of the world doing these exhibitions. France was one of the important countries where they made some exhibitions, but also Germany. Here came once to be exhibited at the AD Galleria. Here you have the documentations of what we happened with that show around 80s in this city. The end of the story is like in 1982, after the dictatorial regime, all the pieces could come back to Santiago de Chile, and in 1992 it was founded the Museo de la Solidaridad Salvador Allende, as we know right now.
Ce musée est un musée en exil. Et quand on parle d'un musée en exil, ça veut dire simplement qu'un régime dictatorial, un régime de force s'est installé dans un pays où les artistes, les intellectuels ont dû trouver refuge à l'extérieur pour continuer leur œuvre. Mais dans le cas de ce musée, l'histoire est encore plus dramatique parce que ce musée avait été une idée de Salvador Allende, qui le voulait à Santiago. Devait s'appeler le musée de solidarité. Et le coup a empêché la réalisation de ça au moment où il y avait déjà des centaines de tableaux donnés par des peintres du monde entier. Ces tableaux sont restés dans les mains de la junte, Dieu sait où ils sont. Et alors, c'est maintenant les Chiliens et d'autres latino-américains en exil qui organisent la résistance contre la junte chilienne, qui ont eu l'idée de faire renaître ce musée à l'extérieur. C'est pour ça que je l'appelle un musée en exil. Et ce sera un musée itinérant. Vous le voyez aujourd'hui à Nancy, et demain vous le verrez, il sera à Berlin, il sera après à Avignon, et Dieu sait où encore, on va essayer de le faire voyager le plus possible. Comme vous avez vu, ce musée se compose d'œuvres d'artistes chiliens, mais aussi il y a la présence internationale, une présence très belle, très généreuse. Tous les artistes les plus représentatifs ont donné leurs œuvres pour être présents avec le travail de résistance culturelle du peuple chilien. Et ce que vous voyez ici à Nancy, ce n'est qu'une partie.